Thank you very much indeed, Kieran. My name is Donald Hobern. I'm Executive Secretary of the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, and I'll explain what that is over the next few minutes. It's a real pleasure to be here today. On behalf of the GBIF Governing Board, I'd like to express our thanks for all of the warm welcome we've received here in Kilkenny, and particularly the way that the National Biodiversity Data Centre has worked to set up such a wonderful venue and meeting for us. We appreciate this, and we appreciate the continued involvement of GBIF Ireland as represented by the data centre in our activities. So I'm based in Copenhagen, Denmark, where GBIF has its secretariat. GBIF was established in 2001 in a response to the suggestion from multiple governments that the world needed what it called a global biodiversity information facility. And the goal really is for us to manage information on the world's plant, animal, fungal, and microbial organisms in a way that can support science, society, and a sustainable future. And for those of you who are aware of some of the international intergovernmental activities that go on in this space, I really see GBIF, represented at the bottom here, as the data layer that provides much of the content that can support us modeling patterns of biodiversity and therefore supporting assessments of trends in biodiversity and ultimately underpinning the kind of commitments and directions that national governments take, especially in the context of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And all of this really contributes to introducing a biodiversity component to our global long-term sustainability thinking up at the level of the Sustainable Development Goals. So what we do may be very local. It may involve sticking heads in hedges, but it's all part of helping us at a bigger scale to think about the challenges of conservation and sustainability. GBIF has been bringing together data from around the world over the last 16 years, and just in the last few months, reached the point where more than 1 billion different point records came together through our network and are accessible, downloadable through the GBIF data portal. Each of those billion records represents some kind of evidence that some species was found at some time and some place. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. This is the spread of the data points in the network today. It represents, in some senses, the level of effort globally in making data accessible. There's a great deal from Western Europe, from North America and Mexico and parts of Latin America, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and parts of Asia as well. However, there are still enormous gaps, and this represents all of the data that we have in a suitable, easily accessible form for all species. So if we took the birds out of this, if we took the vascular plants out, there'd be many, many more gaps. The kind of information we manage is represented here by an example page from within GBIF. You can't see the detail on the left. It's a record associated with an ant that was collected in Costa Rica. And within GBIF, the information that's associated with this specimen, much of which you can see inscribed on the labels there, is transformed into a digital record that allows us to filter it in all kinds of different ways. It includes information about the taxonomy of this organism, that it's an ant of a particular species, where and when it was found, the fact that there is a specimen in a collection associated with this, where you would go to get the specimen. This is one of the major categories of information that comes into GBIF. But another very large proportion comes from field observers, bird watchers, other naturalists, professional scientists in the field observing, counting, monitoring organisms and sharing their data. And as we go forward, more and more information is expected also to be coming to us from more automated processes, artificial intelligence recognizing bird songs or identifying camera trap images or even identifying trees from space, as well as a big opportunity for us to bring in more information based on sequencing of DNA in the environment. So that's, at a high level, what GBIF is doing and what the national GBIF activities are contributing to at a global scale. And that's valuable. It gives us a large pool of data to play with in trying to understand biodiversity. But I want to try and bring this back to a more personal level. For me, this is how I think of biodiversity. I grew up on the east coast of the UK in Essex I didn't just grow up in 1970, in the 60s and 70s, a long time ago. 40 years ago, I can think back to bird watching at a place called Walton on the Naze, and I remember a lot of the things I'd see very regularly as I went around that area. I'd see many shorebirds, sandlings, and other species, large numbers of starlings. I remember very clearly burnet moths being things that I encountered regularly. I remember, probably partly because of the enormous numbers of rabbits there were then, there were lots of stoats and weasels. I used to see them when I was out bird watching, running ahead of me. I remember an occasion when I was sitting in a ramshackle hide overseeing a little tern colony for the day and seeing my first pseudoscorpion scuttling across the woodwork there. So these are some of my memories. If I go back to the same place, which I do still sometimes, I visit relatives in the area, I notice certain things. Now, some of these are just my impressions, I'm sure, but others are very clear. If I look around, for almost all the bird species, the numbers seem much, much lower. I remember before skylarks, you'd never be out of earshot of 3 or 4 birds singing at once. If I hear one in the distance singing now, that's about as good as it gets a lot of the time. Starlings, definitely, I've seen more in Ireland in the last few days than I have in a long time in the area where I grew up. I don't know when I last saw a burnet moth. To be honest, I don't know when I last saw a song thrush in the UK. The last stoat or weasel I saw was that dead one. That was in this area I went to, but I haven't seen a living one there for a long, long time. Still pseudoscorpions. If I turn over the leaf litter and the timber on the strand line, definitely pseudoscorpions there. And there are new things. There are little egrets everywhere. So change, some of it from new species moving in. Chetty's warblers are there as well. So definitely some influence of climate change. A lot of loss of numbers of things that used to be common, some disappearance, and a few other gains that are more, perhaps, well, I'm grateful to see the species from warmer climates, but sparrowhawks are there now, never in my childhood, so that's a plus. That's a plus. But overall, there are changes, and evaluating the significance of these changes is a large part of what we have to do to think about conservation and more generally about sustainability. What happens in one site may not be so significant. It may be part of a broader pattern. How do we understand these things, and how do we see where the critical changes are happening? They happen in time and in space, and we've got to understand them. This article was referenced in some of the newspapers this week. It came out a few days ago, and in a sense, it's a real kick in the stomach. It's unclear how general these conclusions are, but this is based on a study in Puerto Rico. What it says is that, again, over a 40-year period, complete coincidence, my 40 years were set up before I came across this, a 2-degree rise in ambient temperature in the Luquillo rainforest seems to have been associated with an absolutely massive decline in all arthropods, well, in flying insects and in terrestrial crawling insects. For some groups, particularly with sticky traps of crawling insects, 40 years ago, the sample sizes were 60 times as large as those they're getting today. Again, it may just be one site. It's a cloud forest, as I recall, so maybe it's under very particular pressure. But things like this are alarming, but it's very hard to know how to tell the big picture, how to know what we should be doing as a human race to be thinking about biodiversity in the context of a long-term sustainable future for the human race, for our food security, our energy security, for handling the needs of a world population where there still is severe poverty in many areas. How do we work to address all of these things and at the same time allow for the natural systems around us to continue in some sustainable form? So I'll come back now to GBIF. GBIF certainly doesn't help us to answer all of these questions. We have data from many parts of the world, as I indicated. We have a growing volume of data, and I would hope that in the next few years, we'll be looking back to 1 billion with just, I suppose, a wry smile at just what a small number that was. I think that there's real opportunity for vast upscaling of some of the kinds of monitoring and measuring approaches that have been used, and also for giving us more historical data from the specimens and other sources. This represents a study just based on the more or less random data. I won't say random because it obviously comes from, very often, from somewhat planned activities and from consistent effort by many people. But just to explain what this is for two countries, for Sweden and for Finland, for 3 butterfly species that are reasonably common and well recorded. It's across the bottom, the scale represents years from, I can't see, 1960, I think, up to 2010. And of all of the records for all butterflies in GBIF from these countries for each of those years, it shows the percentage of records that corresponds to each of these species, brimstone and whichever tortoiseshell that is, and swallowtails. And this is really crude. This is just data from whatever observations, whatever lepidopterists, recorded data, some data from collections. There's no belief that there was consistent level of effort and monitoring across most of this activity. But still, we can see very clearly, just by bringing together lots of data, that for a couple of these species, there seems to have been, in both countries, and that's independent, a clear trend that these are a more prominent part of the butterfly fauna. It may be that the biomass as a whole has been coming down, but that the swallowtails proportionately seem to, at least on some measure, to have been reducing as part of the butterfly fauna. That doesn't tell us anything absolute. It's a relative measure. But we can get some signals simply from sweeping together enough data. One of the things that GBIF is doing in conjunction with many of our partners around the world is trying to get stronger signals that allow us to have better comparisons, not just on that basis, but through time and space of the composition of biodiversity in any place and of the relative abundance of species. So this slide's not particularly interesting, but the example I showed you before of an ant specimen, this is a specimen which may or may not have been collected at the same time as other insects or other organisms in a particular place. And it certainly tells us that that ant, what was occurring in that locality at that time. It doesn't tell us whether it was the most abundant ant species. It doesn't tell us how that may have changed over time, how that varied compared to other sites in the area. A lot of the work that researchers here in Ireland and all over the world do is to count plants and animals using standardized methodologies. They may follow a transect in a regular way. They may lay out a quadrant on the ground and count plant species. They may operate a MOBILIZE trap or some light trap in a standardized way so that they can count the insects and other organisms that come to these attractions. When this happens, these data sets include much more information than just the presence of a species in a particular place. They tell us something about the relative abundance, something that could be comparable with other times and places where the same methodology was used. And so GBIF has been putting a lot of focus in the last couple of years into supporting mobilization of data in this form, so that rather than just having the ability to stack up all of the butterfly counts for an area and determine one species seems to be declining or increasing, we have the opportunity to base some of the measurements on actual counts in comparable ways at a particular time and place. And obviously there's all kinds of other questions. I don't want to ignore the issues around detectability and the ability to identify different species in different conditions. Nevertheless, we are seeing a growing volume of data that is structured far beyond those initial data points that were coming into GBIF, and giving us in principle the chance to start thinking at different sites and across time about changes in species patterns. And what we actually really need to be able to do is start thinking about similar patterning at the global scale, at the best resolutions we can. If I go back to my reference to 40 years on the Essex coast at the beginning, what I have in mind is a picture of the groups of species, the ones that were really common, the ones that were really rare and exciting when you finally found one in that place at that time. And now I have a mental map today that corresponds in a similar way. There are whole groups of organisms that I don't see, I don't recognize. I'm a terrible botanist, but for the parts of which I'm aware, I could draw up something a little like this. Different times and places, these species were really common, these species were rare. And putting that together, building up a picture that represents the whole planet as a set of little cells in time and space, and the biodiversity in those times and places. And so GBIF is trying to organize information to feed into a workflow around a concept that's termed essential biodiversity variables that would allow observations, measurements from all kinds of sources, including satellites, citizen science, observers, eDNA, environmental DNA, to flow through as data sets into the GBIF network, to be organized as easily sliced and explored aggregations of all available data, and then to underpin modeling efforts that take into account climate, environment, soils, and other factors, and indeed codependence between species, to model and interpolate the actual patterns that we believe hold in time and in space. And for those of you who have some familiarity, for example, with climate modeling, there's a lot of similarity here. We're trying to understand complex systems by organizing the evidence that can underpin those. GBIF is also working with many other partners to do other things. As we go through time, the names that are attached to old specimens may not be the same as the currently accepted name for a species. Lots of common ducks have recently been moved to new genera. That means that it's not a simple job of looking for a particular text string inside a data record to know what we consider the species to be today. We need to understand the names of species, how they're organized into taxonomic hierarchies, and to strengthen the kinds of data we can get from other sources with this information. And a large part of what GBIF and its partners and associated projects such as the Catalogue of Life are working on is trying to put in place a comprehensive global framework that will support the organization of the data taxonomically. Additionally, these species, they're not fully interchangeable. There are properties of different kinds that we associate with the species. Some of them are carnivores, some of them are herbivores, some of them have a direct obligate relationship with some host plant. Others have attributes that we assign to them that are important. They may be threatened. We may consider them of a conservation priority. Understanding that in the context of the data we're organizing is also important. It helps us to understand in a more rapid way some of the key characteristics from a human standpoint of the, and deep from a biotic standpoint as well, of the range of species found in any particular place. And one of the most important ones for us thinking about the long-term sustainability and richness of biodiversity is understanding which species are invasive. So again, another activity which has been going on in the last couple of years has been a global activity led by colleagues at IUCN to organize checklists initially on a country-by-country level of all of the species that are considered to be introduced and or invasive within those species, within those countries. So for example, here for American mink, we have a number of checklists provided by different countries, including one from Ireland, which shows us that this is one of the invasive species in the country and allows direct linkage to the American mink records from Ireland or from the UK or Italy. What GBIF is trying to do is not just create a great big spreadsheet of data points for what species have been found in different times and places, but also to ensure the linkages to other categories of information such as this, so that researchers can more quickly and readily explore the data. Understanding species traits, understanding species interactions is another part of this, much more complicated than just listing introduced species. But we're working to harvest such information from other sources as we go forward. And clearly, geography is an important aspect because so much of the biodiversity, the effort around understanding and managing biodiversity happens quite naturally at national or subnational scales. GBIF already offers pages that summarize both the levels of effort and the known information about biodiversity for each country and territory around the world. From this, you can understand, for example, if you search through the sections on the page on Ireland on the GBIF website, you can understand where all of the data that relates to Ireland is coming from, how Irish data are contributing to understanding of biodiversity in other countries. You can start finding some of the research that's been based on data mobilized through GBIF for Ireland. But many groups are managing data on completely different areas from this. They may be managing a protected area, and there is a global data set, the World Database of Protected Areas, that provides boundary and management information on protected areas. There's also a number of data sets that provide subnational boundary information. And we're working in the next year or so to increase the geographic information within GBIF so that we can provide similar levels of reporting, summary information at the level of states, provinces, counties, protected areas, etc. Right now, if you can go into GBIF and you can search and filter in ways that give you access to this information, but we want to simplify and summarize it. I've mentioned several times the fact that researchers, or anyone in fact, can download data from GBIF, and this is an important part of what we try to achieve. With 1 billion records, some subset of that may be of relevance in exploring a question such as the occurrence and spread of American mink in Ireland. So we have options for filtering all of these data in many different ways and allowing any user to download the data and be given a reference that they can cite if they ever publish any research based on this, but also in the future to be able to re-access the data that they've downloaded. What you get is typically, with various other supporting information, a spreadsheet of records that you can then, so long as it's not too large, import into Excel or into a database and analyze in various ways. For those of you who make use of R as a statistical and programming language, there are packages and libraries that allow you to do that. And more generally, if anyone here is a software developer, we have an API that makes it very easy to access and explore the data as JSON and in other formats. What we do want, though, is to make it easier for anyone to be able to come to the site and get quicker answers, rather than having to process a spreadsheet of the kind I was just showing you, to be able to get pivoted, summarized information of various kinds. It's not that hard to write a program that will take all of the Scandinavian noctuid moth species data out of GBIF and structure it like this so that you can get a sense of the relative abundance of species in different countries, and faceted in all sorts of other ways as well. But there's no reason why we can't be providing better interfaces to simplify these kinds of things. So I just want to bring it back a little bit to thinking about why we are so excited about having activities such as the National Biodiversity Data Centre and the other GBIF activities in countries around the world. The simple fact is that for many questions, although we may be able to give pretty clear answers at useful levels of scale for space and time for some species, there are still big areas of the world where we do not have adequate data to be able to see all of the patterns clearly and to understand change across the landscape. This here is just a summary view for bird data from Brazil in the GBIF network. Birds, by and large, are far and away the best recorded group in most parts of the world. Many bird watchers traveling to many parts of the world and recording the species they see. The intensity of the dots from pale yellow to dark red indicates the number of species for which GBIF has evidence of their occurrence in each of those cells. And it's very clear that looking at this scale of dot, it's a very inadequate view of the pattern, apart perhaps from parts of the southeast, and even between adjacent spots, the ability to talk sensibly about all of the differences in species composition. It's just completely inadequate. So there's a great deal more we need to be able to do if we do want to understand spatial and temporal patterns. And so there are two things that I think we see as particularly important, especially at the national level, and my colleague Greg Riccardi will be talking about some of these aspects in his presentation in a few minutes. But first of all, we need to find good ways to help everyone who is collecting or who has collected relevant data on species, time, space, and abundance, and anything else that they've recorded about the traits and measurements, species interactions, whether there's a specimen held in a collection, any imagery, any sequences, to organize this information so that it is more readily discoverable, so that we can recognize and understand those patterns. And around the edge of this slide, I've indicated 8 of the categories of information. They overlap in various ways. 8 of the categories of information that can give us precisely these kinds of data records to come together. I've mentioned specimens at the beginning. I've touched in various ways upon citizen science, a very major stream of information for us, and on survey data, which underpins most of the sampling event data that we have in GBIF today. Additionally, there are atlas data sets which already represent a digested, consumed version of some of this information, and it may be very hard in some cases to get back to the original underlying observations and records. But even Atlas data gives us information that at higher level scales can be useful in understanding those patterns. And then on top of that, radio transmitters on the backs of birds, like that Clark's nutcracker, sequences, remote sensing, and a lot of information that we can try to mine out of the historical literature. So it's all very well for me to speak of, we'll just get all this information mobilized. All of it represents work by people to set up these studies, to go out and make observations, to digitize historical information. It represents intellectual effort and ultimately some kind of ownership of the information. And we need to be working with all of the data holders so that we can ensure a real value proposition for them in sharing information. I've touched on some of the reasons why we believe we are an environment that does that. For many people who are observing biodiversity, the importance of conservation and sustainability is very clear, and it's also very clear that only by understanding biodiversity can we conserve it. But additionally, we are doing everything we can to ensure visibility and prominence in all of the data downloads and through the data citation mechanisms for all of the sources of information that help us to address particular questions. And a lot of the social work of building understanding and sharing expectations and smoothing the technical difficulties that face people in making their data available can only really be resolved at the national level. And so activities such as the National Biodiversity Data Centre are really critical as part of a global effort to understand biodiversity. And so I just wanted, lastly, and I think this will connect more with some of the things that Greg wants to talk about, flip this around as well and say that the other challenge is then making sure that the information that we do have, the information that is available, is used in land use planning, in conservation, in thinking about response to climate change, in determining the biodiversity value of different areas of the landscape if we have to make trade-offs between suburban development or agricultural use or energy use increasingly. How do we make those decisions? How do we determine whether it's better to maintain an area for biodiversity or to maintain an alternative area for the same purpose? To do that, we need to be making the connections not just with all of the wonderful observers and researchers who are collecting data, but also with those who can use this information to make better decisions and to plan a better future for us all. And so, again, GBIF can't solve all of those problems at the global scale. They're challenging, but the work of bodies such as the data center here and many of the other GBIF activities around the world are really critical in showing how these data are accessible, how they can be used, and arguing for their adoption as part of such planning. Thank you.
Well, thank you very, very much. Our next speaker is